The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everyone. Welcome. And those of you that joined in the past few weeks, welcome back. And thank you for being with us here. My name is Jawahar. I'm hosting this series of webinars based on the theme of PowerTips. And I'm joined by my co-host, Joel Bryan. He's our head of global technical support. And as you have seen, we have completed 3 in the past of this series. This is the 4th week. And yeah, it seems like we are still working from home, at least most of us, and things are slowly opening up. So here's here's where we stand. So I'm going to turn it over to Joel to talk about today's session and also today's speaker. And we have a pretty elaborate setup now, Joel. I see a bunch of, it looks like Star Wars video in the back.
Thanks, Jawahar. As Javi said, my name is Joel Bryan, and I'm Global Director of Post-Sales Support, Documentation, and Services here at Legrand for the Raritan and the Servertech brands. And today in our 4th session, we're going to focus on how to create additional logins for our remote users on our PDUs. And walking us through this session, as he did previous sessions, is Bruce Clare, who is our post-sales support product specialist as part of our technical support organization here at Legrand, serving the Raritan and the Servertech brands. And following the walkthrough, we will open up for questions pertaining to this particular function and feature. And in addition, please feel free to type your questions as we go along, and we could certainly read those after Bruce is finished with the walkthrough. And for any pressing issues that's outside the scope of this, it's always best to email us at support@servertech.com, or if you want to talk to one of our product specialists, just give us a call on our 800 number, and we'll be there to certainly help you through whatever issues you may be having. Okay, so with that, we're going to get started, and I'm going to pass the ball over to Bruce. Okay, Bruce?
Yep, thank you, Joel. Welcome, everyone. As Joel mentioned, today's topic is how to create additional logins for remote users. And this session will discuss the default account credentials. We're going to take a look at where in the web interface we'll find various settings related to user accounts. I'm going to demonstrate how to create new administrator accounts as well as new user accounts with various access levels. We're going to show you how a user can change their own password. I'm going to discuss an option for strong passwords. Take a very quick look at where you can define SNMP version 3 user accounts if you're using SNMP. And then we'll talk briefly about centralized user management using authentication servers such as LDAP Radius and TACX. So let's get started. I am going to log into a PDU at the Server Technology Technical Support Lab in Reno, Nevada. And you do need to log in with administrator credentials in order to create new accounts. So you can see in the upper right-hand corner that I have logged in as an administrator. I have actually used the default account. The out-of-box default for username is ADMN, that's admin without an I, and the password is, or the username is not case sensitive. The default password I used was also ADMN, no I, and it is case sensitive, must be lowercase. If you're running firmware version 8.0Q or later, which you can see upon the initial login, I'm at the current version R, 8.0Q and later. If you were the one that set it up originally, you would have been forced to change the password upon the initial login. So ADMN is probably not your password anymore. So I've logged in as an administrator, and Let's take a look at where we find settings related to user accounts. It's going to be using the menuing system on the left. We want to start at configuration. And primarily, you're going to deal with the access page. So configuration access, we're going to have options for local users, LDAP groups, SNMP version 3 users, and TACAX privileges, which is effectively users. The other place to find settings related to user accounts is configuration network. And I'm not going to click into them right this moment, but we have LDAP settings, radius settings, TACAX, and we'll look at those briefly in just a little while. So let's go back to configuration access. And the first thing I'm going to do is show you how to create a new administrator level account. And that's going to be done in the local users. And you start by creating a new account. I'm just going to call it admin A. Choose a password, repeat the password, and click apply. So we now have in the list the default account still, which is ADMN, and the new account admin-A. All new accounts, when initially created, have just a access level of user, which means that the administrator defines what that user can do. In order to provide administrative rights to that user, you click the edit button to the far right of the row for that new user. And then we have a drop-down list that gives choices for different levels. We'll talk about that in more detail in a little bit, but you want to select administrator to give this new user admin privileges. Click apply, and now we should see that we have 2 administrators, and I will show you logging in with that new account. Okay, so I've now logged in as that new administrator. I have access to everything. Now, I don't recommend doing it without verifying ahead of time that nobody is using the default admin account, the ADMN account, if it still exists. But I do want to point out that once you have created a second administrative level account, you can log out and log in with that new admin account, and you then have the ability to completely remove the default admin account. So we can completely remove the account so that nobody out in the world even knows the username, and you've already changed the password. So let's take a look next at creating a non-administrative user. It's going to be a very similar process. And I've now created a new user named Bruce. And we can see again that the default access level is user. And right now, as an administrator, I can go in and provide different access levels. I will show you that in a moment, but I'm going to click on edit first, and we'll take a look at the different access levels that can be defined for a user. We have this up. You can take a look at that as I explain it. The administrator is full access, gives you control for configuring items, turning outlets on and off if it's a SwitchPDU, everything there is to configure and operate. A power user, second in the list, it's a shortcut. It allows you to define quickly a new user that has access to everything and as far as control and monitoring, but they cannot configure anything. So it's a quick way to create a user that can do things other than make changes, versus a user is fully defined by the administrator. We'll take a look at that in a moment. A reboot only user, it really only applies to a SwitchPDU. But if you create a reboot only user, that user will have the ability to issue reboot commands only. They would not be able to issue a command to turn an outlet off or to turn an outlet that was off on. They would only be able to reboot, which is to power down, automatically some delay later, 15 seconds by default, power back on. So they would have the ability to reboot devices, but would not have the ability to turn them on and off. An on-only user is similar. It just gives you the ability only to switch an outlet on, and that would typically be used during installation type processes. If you're using a third party to install equipment, you will most likely have already created an on-only account for those users. You've got outlets that are turned off until they need to be used. You can give that account out to a third-party person. They can install the device in the cabinet, plug it in, log in, and turn the outlet on, and nothing else. So it doesn't create any risk as far as the time frame before you're able to remove that account. And then finally, a view-only account is what it sounds. It allows somebody to see everything but have no control. So let's take a look at where you would configure some of these items. I'm going to leave Bruce as a user. I am still logged in as an administrator. And System Monitor, I've just enabled for the user Bruce. System Monitor effectively gives that user the ability to see all the values that I can see here as administrator. All of the measured values, status of the outlets, power values, voltage, etc. So System Monitor, back to where I was. System Monitor, I didn't click apply. System Monitor gives the ability to view things that you would see under the monitoring page as an administrator. You do have the ability to grant access to routing telnet or SSH sessions out the console ports. I'm not going to enable that. If there are outlet groups created, if it's a SwitchPDU, you can grant access to the groups to that user. And then finally, this is a SwitchPDU. It has 36 outlets that I can control individually, and the administrator can pick and choose which outlets that user has control of. So we've created a user named Bruce, given him access to 3 outlets and groups, and the System Monitor. Okay. So I've logged in as the user Bruce. Again, you can see that in the upper right-hand corner. I am able to view status because I was given System Monitor access. And we can drill further into that if we wanted to. View voltage, all the other stuff. Okay. And then control. As you can see, I have access to only 3 outlets. So every user can have access to 1 outlet, all outlets, any number in between. They can overlap. One user can access outlets 1 through 10. The other could be 8 through 14. There's never a need to share passwords. Every user will have their own username, their own password, and their own unique allowances with respect to access and control. Right. I'm going to log back out and log in as an administrator. Okay, so the next topic is how to change your own password. And the reason this is important is because the administrator needs to create the account and choose an initial password, and then the administrator will provide that information to the new user. When that information is provided, the administrator needs to provide instruction to that user to change their own password. And I suppose I should have stayed logged in as Bruce. So my administrator told me my username, Bruce, gave me a password. And my first time I log in, I need to go to the tools page and change password. Need to put in your current password. New password, and then verify the new password. Password has been changed. At this point, only I know what password I chose. The administrator no longer has any knowledge. The audit trail is true. Do need to go back as an administrator. The next topic is strong passwords. We have an option to enforce the use of strong passwords. We are going to find that under configuration, access on the general page. And that option is right here. So if we set strong passwords to be required, what that means is passwords will need to be a minimum of 8 characters with at least 1 uppercase letter, 1 lowercase letter, 1 digit, and 1 special character, such as an asterisk or an exclamation mark. And it also means that when a password is changed, the new password needs to differ in at least 4 character positions versus the old password. So that is an option. If you desire to have strong passwords, you can enable that option, then click apply. And the next thing to take a look at quickly is SNMP version 3 users. Configuration network SNMP. The page that comes up first is where you define all the details for SNMP version 2 and for version 3, where traps are sent and so forth. And for version 3, we have an SNMP users configuration button. And I'm not going to actually do it, but you would define a username. You would choose the authentication method and privacy method, which presently we support MD5 for authentication and DES, also known as 3 DES for privacy. I'd like to inform you that with our very next firmware release, 8.0S, we will be adding SHA-1 as an option for the authentication method, and AES 128 will be available for privacy. So look for that coming out soon. And SNMP3 users would be defined here. Oops, I'm sorry, you would put in a username, put in the password and privacy password, click apply, and you'll have it show up in this list down here. I'm not going to proceed to do that. You can have up to 8 SNMP version 3 users defined. Okay, and the final thing to take a look at is the optional methods for third-party authentication, that is authentication with the centralized LDAP server, Radius, or TACAX server. We support all 3 of those, but only 1 can be used at any given time. So if you're using LDAP, then you cannot use Radius. Or TACAX, if you're using Radius, you cannot use LDAP or TACAX. And if you're using TACAX, you cannot use LDAP or Radius. So any one of the 3 is what you would choose. Hopefully you have that enabled already, because if you do, then you have the ability at the central server to add users through the method available at the server. So what I've demonstrated today is how to create accounts that are within the PDU itself, local accounts. And there is one important thing to talk about with respect to LDAP Radius and TACAX, and that is if you have created a new account locally within the PDU, but LDAP is enabled, it is actually enabled in this PDU, but if you've created a new account in the PDU and have not done anything at the server side, the LDAP server, Radius, or TACAX server, it is very important that you make sure that this option here, the access method option, is set to try LDAP first, then local, versus LDAP only. If you choose LDAP only, that means the PDU will only allow access if it is able to authenticate with the LDAP server, Radius, or TACAX server. If you choose LDAP then local, if you are unable to authenticate, that is, the PDU is able to communicate with the server, but you are not able to authenticate due to invalid credentials, it will fall back and let you attempt to log in using the local database. So the account that I just created, Bruce, for example, I do not have defined on the LDAP server, but I was able to log in because it was set for LDAP then local. If it was LDAP only, I would not have been able to log in. So be sure that if you're defining new accounts and LDAP Radius or TACAC is being used, you need to make sure that the then local is selected either for Radius, for TACAC, or for LDAP. Now, I would point out that if you have it set for LDAP only, it will still allow fallback to attempting authentication against the local database, but only if the LDAP server is unreachable. So if the LDAP server is down or otherwise unreachable, only in that case will it fall back to allowing a local attempt. It will not allow fallback to allowing a local login attempt if the server is responsive, but you cannot authenticate. Okay. And LDAP groups are defined on this page. And hopefully you are using LDAP or one of those, but otherwise with what I've just provided you, you have the ability to create your own new accounts. And so long as that it allows fallback to the local, even if you're using LDAP Radius or TACAC, you've got the ability to log in with the new account that you just created. So with that, I will pass it back to Joel and we'll take some questions.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Bruce. That was certainly great and definitely informative. And as you were walking through, the question I would have is, how would you change local users on multiple PDUs to say sync with the corporate policy of the required change every 60 to 90 days? How would you handle that?
Okay, well, yeah, the PDU itself doesn't have a policy to force a password change on a period, so you'd be managing that externally, and you're clearly talking about changing on more than just one PDU. What we looked at today was, just with one PDU. Amongst the simplest ways for mask configuration, or much easier than logging into every single PDU, would be to well, the easiest way is to use our STIC protocol, what's known as the Server Technology INI protocol, which we did discuss in last week's session. We used it to configure thresholds in the PDU. It can also be used to configure user accounts. So the easiest thing to do is start by going to configuration and then files. In the config.ini file, you would save that to your local system. And then you can just cut out everything that does not apply to user accounts. You would also remark out this very first line that specifies a NIC serial number. That if that line is not remarked out, then the file will only be accepted by the PDU with that particular network interface card serial number. So you would get the file from the PDU, save the file, remove everything, remark out the NIC serial number line, remove everything that it does not apply. And let me just get to quickly. So we have this whole section called user. You can just deal with just this section. You would go in and change the password. You need to look at our STIC document. I can show you where that is if you'd like, because it defines the hash that's required. In some cases, it's I think in AES 256, in other cases, 64 character AES 128. But the point being that you can simply edit the file, save the config.ini file, save it with the names like users perhaps, and when you need to make a change across the board, you would go in and change the password for all of the users. We have an admin user, we have the other one that I created today, admin-A, and that's its password. We have the new user, Bruce, that we created today as well, and that was its password. So you'll have a master file that you'll be able to push out to all the different PDUs, and you'll just edit that file every 60 days, 90 days, whatever the policy is, and then use the simplest method would be to use SFTP, Secure File Transfer Protocol, to push that INI file out to the various PDUs. So you don't need to log into each and every one, use SFTP to put the file to the PDU, and then it will be updated. And you'll do that across the board. You could most likely write a script to do that in a more automated fashion.
Okay, great. Thank you, Bruce. So I'm going to unmute everybody, and if you have questions, feel free to go ahead and ask. I do ask that you check your local device as well to make sure that it is indeed off of mute. So at this point, everybody should be unmuted, and we're free to ask any questions that you may have. And Javi, did we have anything come in via chat?
I don't see anything on the chat now, but I did hear somebody maybe tried to ask a question. Okay. Yeah, so I don't see any other questions. So yeah, I think that's excuse me. That's basically what we wanted to cover today. But I did want to put a plug for something new that we're starting, Joe. We saw the response to this series, and there's obviously a need for sharing what we know and what we do well. So we're starting a series starting Tuesday. It'll be every Tuesday to share some of the common challenges that we have seen in our customer base and how we have solved with our solutions. So I think there's a lot that we could share that would be very useful for our customers. So stay tuned for the details, and we'd love to have you join the Tuesday series as well.
Sure, great. That's going to be great. Thank you, Javi, for sharing. So with that, we'd like to say again, thank you for joining. We'll do this again next Thursday to wrap up our series, but we'll certainly have some sort of regular cadence going forward on PowerTips Live, and so we'll announce that as we get this as we get the schedules in progress. And we'll publish that so that you'll get notified when we have more tech tips coming. But for sure, next Thursday, we'll be here again at the same time. Okay, thank you everybody for joining, and have a great rest of your day.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.